Commission and Zoning Board of Appeals meeting. We've got a relatively short agenda tonight, and we'll do a roll call and call to order, please.
Member Burns?
Here.
Member Danley?
Here.
Member Miller? Here. Member Murray is absent. Member Ryder?
Here.
Member Russell is absent. Chair Peters?
Here.
You have a quorum.
Thank you. And before we go to agenda item number 2, I would just like to, on behalf of the commission, welcome Ms. Susan Ryder Porter to the commission. Susan is a longstanding Lake Bluff resident and a former longstanding member of the school board, so she'll bring a great deal of expertise, both professionally and socially, to the commission, and we appreciate the fact now that we're back at full strength. So
Great, thanks.
thank you very much.
Thank you.
Agenda item number 2, non-agenda items and visitors. We allow for public comment time where any of the citizenry can present, approach the dais, and we allocate 3 minutes to address any sort of issues that are not on the agenda tonight. Sir, are you want to take part in that? Okay. We do not have any such activity tonight, so we'll go on to agenda item number 3, preliminary workshop for Imperial Motors Jaguar of Lake Bluff. Mr. Cole, if you want to give a brief overview before the presenters approach.
Certainly. So, nice, short memorandum tonight, very easy to follow along with, I hope. Right now, Imperial Motors operates their Jaguar dealership kind of at the north end of the business park, where they have direct access to Route 41. They have a nice Tudor-style construction building. They, as I understand, I'm sure they'll speak more to it, have been asked by Jaguar's corporate management, as it were, to adopt a new style of trade dress, adopt some new architectural appearance requirements that require some pretty extensive changes to their site. And we understand that they're working, thinking is rather than tear down what they have at that site to instead expand to a new site located a little further south along the same side of the same road in the business park, build their new structure there, and then be able to repurpose the existing structure for something else. So they've provided some conceptual plans that are included in the packet. This project, if it proceeds, would require a special use permit for a car dealership. It would require at least one, probably multiple forms of variations. Again, that would depend on final plans we receive. But they wanted to come in front of you at an early date to present their concept, to see if there were any questions or areas of concern from the commission before they continue through the development process.
All right, thank you very much. If you would like to begin your presentation, please identify yourself for the record, and we'll go forward. Yes, thank you.
Good evening, and thanks for meeting for us. I'm Jordan Aaron, president of Imperial Motors Jaguar. It's a family-owned business since 1953. So we actually had, globally there's a corporate image upgrade for every Jaguar dealership in the world. And so this design that you see in front of you is every dealer in the world is going to look that way. So it's actually started back, we actually presented a different corporate image back in 2014 to you folks, which was approved. And then as we were going to building permits, they changed. So everything came to a grinding halt, and this is the new version. So, we've had the property that is to the south about the same time that we bought this property, believe it or not. And we felt that instead of, we really like our building, we really didn't want to have to change it. We feel it's well, for business purposes, number one, to be able to build on a separate site and then just move into it. If we redid our current building, we'd literally have to take the entire showroom off to put this front on. We think we have a beautiful building there that looks nice on the highway and can be repurposed fairly easily. And then this building actually looks very impressive as well. There are some around the country up already, And it's a very impressive building because it's a, as you see, there's a lot of glass, and you see right in and see the cars as the art. So that's where we're at. I'll say one other thing. So the design and the layout is very strict. We have a 420 some odd page design intent document that dictates everything that we use. So from the entire design is completely dictated. We cannot deviate at all. So I hate to say that. I know groups like you don't like to hear things like that, but I'm just telling you the way it is. So it's very challenging because we need to do it this way, and I think we've been a pretty good member of Lake Bluff for 20 years now, and we're looking forward to move forward with it.
Well, thank you very much. I just have a couple questions, and then I'll let the commissioners jump in. I guess just to clarify, you already own the property that we're talking about?
Correct.
Okay. And number two, when you look at that 420-page document and you look at our zoning regulations and everything else, are there any specific issues that you've identified that you think might be potentially problematic? And I guess I'm asking perhaps from a density perspective or a height perspective, or has
No.
anything been flagged, so to speak?
I don't think so. I mean, this is Bob Flubacher, who's our architect. He actually did the current building for us, so he would know that better than I.
The only thing that I'm aware of is
Bob, if you want to, thank you.
the only thing I'm aware of is the special use requirement for the car dealership. As far as I know, we don't need any setback variations, height variations, FAR, any of those kind of variations.
Okay, good. I'll let the commissioners jump in. Whoever would like, feel
Mr.
free.
Chairman, if I could respond to that
Yes.
real quick. So there are, as far as the structure itself, at least based on the site plan we have here, that's all. No issues there that we can see. The location of parking would require at least one variation. That's probably unavoidable on this site. So side yard parking would have to be set back at least 10 feet from the property line. And then there's supposed to be no parking in that front 50 feet on the way to Route 41. But as you can see, along Route 41, there are certainly businesses that have received those types of relief before.
Yeah. The site plan that you have in that packet is done by, I would almost say, amateurs that work in the design studio that Jaguar has. And there's a lot of things that just don't work on this, both the floor plan and the site plan. I have with me a preliminary site plan that we've done. Unfortunately, I just have one, large drawing of it. But basically, the building is flipped so that the drive-through is at the south end of the building rather than at the north end of the building. The curb cut is at the south end, because one of the things we're experiencing at the current dealership is that as you come under 176, there's a pretty good stand of trees there. The dealership sign is actually beyond the drive, and the reaction time to be able to see the sign stop and get to the deceleration lane and get into the drive is quick. So here we'd like to, put the drive on the opposite side of the property so they have some time. We are requesting a curb cut on 41. There is currently a deceleration lane that goes in front of the property for the exchange. We would just want to extend that deceleration lane, whatever the IDOT requirements are, to the north of our property and kind of share the same deceleration lane. So the landscape setback, I'm sorry, I forgot to emphasize this. So the 10-foot setback on the sides is on the current site plan that we have.
Okay.
The 50-foot setback, you can see they're kind of mandating that.
Thank you.
I have a question, maybe for Glenn more than anything else. Would this require water retention, given the scope that they're doing to the property to deal with the amount of impervious surface?
Yep, so that's, I guess, a two-part answer. So one, a project at this size, an undeveloped lot, that would be subject to the Lake County Watershed Development Ordinance. So you would have to meet their requirements, essentially meaning that, you know, this wouldn't generate any new net stormwater load off of system or into the public system. You know, they'd have to provide detention or retention and facilitate stormwater on that site. The second thing I would say is, so this particular lot we understand was intended to be developed when the industrial park was platted. It wasn't set aside for stormwater flow or detention or anything like that. We do understand that quite a bit of it goes through the property, and so there may be some unique considerations there as a design engineer gets into the site. You can probably speak to your investigation so far
Yeah.
better than I can. But.
We're very early in kind of putting all the information together, but there's actually 3 layers of water that I need to deal with. Stormwater detention, we expect to put underneath the pavement, store under the pavement. There's certain percentages of green space that we have to have for the water to percolate in and things like that. But we are intending to do that below the surface. We have, back 20 years ago, there was a wetlands delineation done on the property, and there are 3 very small segments of wetlands that are on there. So we need to probably mitigate that. Kind of depends on how large the area is, if we have to mitigate it through the Army Corps of Engineers, or if we have to go to Lake County. But in either way, that small triangular area in the front of the lot on 41 is the anticipated mitigation area. There is also a small portion of floodplain on the very northeast corner of the lot, and that will also be compensatory storage in that same triangular area. So that will be a landscape feature. We have those same issues that we had on the other dealership, and if you're familiar with it, there's a small, you know, water area in front of the existing building too, so very similar in concept.
Well, I mean, in principle, I think this is a great idea. We've enjoyed revenue from your car dealership already and others as well, so I think it's a good business we want to support. Obviously, I think the design is very nice. I don't mind that it's, you know, it's a little bit different than some of the other architecture, but it's a nice classy design. So in general, I think it's, I'm definitely supportive of it. A question that it's certainly not related to my support of it, but have you considered what other business might fit well in your existing building that you would sublease that out or just lease that out to?
Yeah, I mean, it can be converted to an office building. With the height of it, it can actually be a 2-story office building with, you know, some extensive work. Obviously, it can be used for a car dealership as well. But I would anticipate it being more office.
Thank you, David.
I have a question. We had an issue where, or maybe it's more about parking and overflow parking. Seems like other dealerships have had that issue about sort of staying within your property lines, so to speak.
We have not.
And have you had that issue at your current location, and do you foresee how that is with showcasing your cars and parking for other
Yeah.
people?
In our 20 years, we haven't had that issue
Okay.
at all. So I don't anticipate that, no. And in fact, I think we can get actually more parking on this than we have on our current location. So yeah, I really don't anticipate that at all.
No, it's a beautiful building, really. I understand the rebranding and, you know, obviously the limitations or the guidelines that you have to do, but I think it could be a nice addition, and we appreciate your business.
I echo what my associates have said. I have a question for the board. Can we bypass the need for them to come back to do a special use permit for this particular site, knowing that we have other auto dealerships on the site?
Unfortunately, you cannot, because there are the various notice requirements and a public hearing requirement under our code and Illinois law. So we still have to go through that process. The only other option you would have is a text amendment to make auto dealerships not a special use but a permitted use, but that too would require a public hearing and notice and going through the process. So, there's really no way to short circuit it, but we have to have that hearing.
Is there any interest in changing the use permit for this area?
So I will say, we're happy to hear the group's ideas on this. We talked about this a bit internally, so especially after the changes to Chevy Exchange about 18 months ago, coupled with these, it seems like the character of this adjacent area will remain and is turning more towards auto dealerships similar to across the street at Canals. And so we thought, is it appropriate to rezone this to the AP1 district, which is made for auto parks, where these are permitted uses? The rules there aren't quite built for this. They're close. You could do it. It would take a little bit of work, but you could set that up. I mean, the biggest difficulty there is just that it's not the rules that apply up here at Canals are made for relatively large sites. We could turn those down. You can fine tune them, but also there's just not a contiguous block here. It's actually a checkerboard. So you're going to go Imperial Motors, formerly Imperial Motors again, and then I guess I'm losing my bearings. Yeah, Chevy Exchange, punctuating this line, and then Lake Forest Sports Cars is not even contiguous. They're over over here.
I was just thinking that, we can certainly work this in our spare time to reset the code for this, and so so they don't have the need to come back and do this over again. Unless there's unless there's a specific zoning issue that comes up.
We can certainly look into that if the group would like us to.
It just seems it would be redundant unless anybody can think of a reason not to do that.
I'd be open to it.
Okay.
Would that in any way limit what kind of businesses could go into the old facility if we were to designate this AP zone?
Yeah, we'd want to study a bit more, some options to bring back to you. So one option would be make it the AP1 zoning, and that would involve a bit more foreclosing out other future uses of the property. Do you adapt some of these, integrate it into L1? The good news there is, that keeps some of the flexibility, but that may also introduce the possibility for some of these interior lots to change in a manner you may not want to happen without some additional review. And then we can keep working through some permutations of that. But those are essentially the strengths and the drawbacks of how you get to that outcome.
I appreciate that this is not our purview, but I'm curious if you're anticipating 2 curb cuts then, one at the old property and then a few feet later than one at the new property, or moving the one that's currently there?
The addition of a new one.
Uh-huh. And you don't anticipate that being a problem for any reason? I'm the new guy.
I don't think so. That we have to deal with IDOT. I believe in my discussion with Drew Irvin, he was, he thought it should not be a big issue. Could be a long process.
Thanks.
What's your time frame?
We would, to start building or to finish?
Let's say start.
Okay, we would like to start in the spring,
Oh, this year,
yes.
this coming year.
Yeah, I was, originally when I got the packet, I was disappointed from a corporate perspective that you're gonna be subject to going through this huge fiscal transformation, but I was pleased to learn that you do already own the property, and it almost is contiguous, so, basically the same neighborhood. Obviously, there are gonna be drainage-related issues and the curb cut and things like that. But conceptually, I'm also very comfortable with it. I thought that the architecture on your original property, your original structure was exemplary. And, but if you're happy with the more modernistic approach that you're forced to use, I mean, we're gonna be happy with it also from a community's perspective. But I don't have any significant qualms or concerns about it. I think we'd like to work within your timetable as best we can. And I don't necessarily anticipate we'll have a whole lot of resistance from our other two members either.
Great.
I have one more comment, and it has to do with Chevy Exchange's problems with the neighbors and cutting down foliage that they, just be careful what you cut down before going forward, is what I would suggest.
We're in the beginning of doing a tree survey on the property. The preliminary, conversation I've had is that most of the foliage on that lot is buckthorn that's just growing.
I understand that, but barriers between your property and the southern adjacent property.
Yeah, I know what you mean. They cut down the neighbor's property, yeah.
Oh, stay on our property?
Yeah.
In so many words.
That would, yes.
I guess one thing to your comment, Member Miller, one thing I'd ask the group that, just to make sure we're all on the same understanding. So as you can see, the amateur drawing, right?
Right.
I would note that, not a whole lot of screening shown at either side lot line. So again, there are establishments in the park that have a similar situation to this. I think, this group grappled with the Chevy Exchange situation of maybe wishing or considering or exploring whether or not more should have been provided between the dealership and these adjacent offices, especially away from 41, more into the depth of the lot. I guess I would ask the group if your sense is that a minimum of screening is acceptable here, or if there's something you're looking for as far as the landscaping provided at the lot line. And so for illustration, this is the lot we're talking about. Again, this is, as I said, checkerboard. This is flex industrial.
Mm.
In my opinion, given that it's zoned a light industrial area, I wouldn't be thinking that a lot of screening would be necessary, to be honest. I think having enough green space, I'd be looking for that. I'd be less lenient on variances in regards to impervious surface to maintain as much as possible on the green space area, but it's an light industrial park, so as much as I would like to see some screening and have it, I don't know. I think it's, for me, a lower bar than certainly in residential areas.
If I could speak to landscaping just for a minute. The landscaping in the front of the dealership is dictated actually what species of what plant, at what spacing, at what distance away from the glass. The perimeter and the entry points to the lot, because of the level of automobile we're selling, we want to create a more luxurious kind of feel when you enter the property. So we tried to do that at the existing store, and we're going to try to do the same thing at the new store. We don't want people to just feel like they're driving up to an industrial building.
These guys have a lot of time on their hands at Jaguar, huh?
Well,
Makes you think it, doesn't it?
what I was going to say, when we were here in 14, we were going to be one of the last dealerships to build the old design. The old design was a drive-it-clad, behemoth. It was not an attractive thing. So we're actually thrilled that we get to be in the new generation of the branding and have the cleaner, sleeker, more modern look. And it's gonna save them a lot of money in the long run, because if we had done that other remodeling, they would have to be doing it again, probably in 5 years from now.
I'm curious as to what Jaguar's position is on green roofs. Have you had any direction to maybe plant some
I have.
greenery at the top?
I have no knowledge of any of.
Any of that?
Any of that from, that is not in there.
Not yet.
That,
Just add another 5 pages,
Add
congratulations.
a few more pages and you can get yourself a green roof.
They've been silent on that. There are some dealerships throughout the country that have parking on the roof.
Oh, yeah.
So I think they're more flexible to what's happening on the roof than they are elsewhere in the
Yeah.
dealership.
Yeah.
And then will you have access going out to the west?
Yes,
Or egress and access, I
on
guess?
Sherwood, yes.
yes.
Okay. Any other questions or comments from the commission? Any other comments from the prospective applicant?
I don't think so. Appreciate your openness and willingness to help us.
Well, thank you very much, and we look forward to working with you on it. It's a big, big endeavor.
It is, thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.
All right, thank you, Vaughn.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.
All right, agenda item number 4, staff report.
Certainly. So, nice, fast meeting. We'll get you out of here at a lovely hour to enjoy the last of summer. Just a teaser for our upcoming September meeting. Unfortunately, that one you may not get out of here so early, I'm afraid. A longer agenda than we've had in some time, so in no particular order. Recreational cannabis regulations will come back. Again, that meeting did not occur this month. Will be continued to your September meeting to consider. We're hoping to have a staff memorandum exploring some of the issues this group asked about, circulated ahead of the meeting, ahead of our usual packet time, again, to try and make sure there's some room in case there's any additional or follow-up questions.
Can I comment on the cannabis?
Certainly.
My concern with the cannabis, and I'm really ambivalent one way or the other, is that we, as a group, do not make the decision whether cannabis should be allowed or disallowed in Lake Bluff. I find the zoning board should be confined to zoning and rules and regulations. We get a bad taste of what can happen through the Airbnb problem, or where people came to us saying oppose it or support it. And we got involved in that decision-making, and it didn't matter. The village board did what was necessary in their minds to do. But I don't think we should have been at that point where we were making any decisions. I feel the zoning board should be given a mandate by the village that says, yes, we want cannabis, please give us zoning regulations. Not to say, should we have cannabis or shouldn't we have cannabis? We're not elected. We shouldn't be making those decisions. So I hope when cannabis comes up, we really limit our talk to, if we do have cannabis, what would be the regulations we would set? And not say, well, we oppose or we agree with having cannabis.
I do have a comment about that. And as much as I certainly appreciate your point of view, I really struggled, really on the flip side of it. I'm not trying to be adversarial, but I found it really challenging for the group, for our commission, to react when, in the short-term rentals in particular, when the instruction was put a regulation together, put an ordinance together, what have you, as if you were going to approve it. And what was challenging to me, or what I saw as a commissioner, was that there were several members on the board that were opposed to it. And so how do you come up with an ordinance when you're opposed to it? And what ended up happening is I felt like we were moving toward unreasonable extremes to effectively and practically oppose it. To basically say, we're not gonna allow this to happen because we're so against it. We're gonna say, you know, things like, you can do it twice a year.
But I
Or
see
even
that happen.
economically. And I think the problem is if you're not given the opportunity to say, here's what we've heard from the public and here's what we think, if you just said, well, we're going to mandate that it is allowed, if you don't agree with it as a commission, it makes it very challenging to say, well, how are we going to put stipulations? Well, we're not gonna allow this, or we're not gonna allow this, or we're not gonna allow this, but we'll allow this little teeny little piece because they told us to allow certain segments of it. And so I see it a little bit differently. I totally appreciate your perspective, but I do agree the board, they're gonna make the decision on this, but I think trying to kind of shoehorn an ordinance that we may not be on board with based on public sentiment. I mean, we're trying to take the public's view and we have our judgment on this, but trying to kind of fit something that we believe is the right thing to do into a mandate, I found that to be challenging.
Right, and it's going to be the same way. We're all going to have our own personal opinions about cannabis, and I feel the board should make the decision, they're elected officials, and say, we want cannabis, and and then zoning comes in after that. We shouldn't be ahead, putting the cart before the horse.
And I agree with that if they put sufficient detail on what they want in the ordinance. So if they say, we want this, 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 and this, come up with a reasonable ordinance that allows that in reasonable amount. But to leave it open-ended, I think is
Well, why go
It's challenging.
Why go through it if we don't even know how the board's going to vote on it? Why waste all that time?
Well, I think it's an important element of what we're doing and getting public feedback and really giving our approval. And if the board decides to go another way, then they do. But we've taken the testimony from the public, we've discussed, we come up with our recommendation, and we let them decide. And if it's not on the same page, then so be it. But if they come back and say, we disagree, we think you should do it, which is kind of what happened with short-term rental, well, then it better be under enough detail that we can just enact. That's, I
I
guess.
think it's a waste of our time.
I'm
So I guess I would respond with two things. So first, I can detect the village attorney's spidey sense tingling that there's only so much of this we should discuss without properly having it on the agenda.
Actually, we're not taking final action, we're not really, I think it's fine to discuss, you know.
My
understand
spidey
this is-
sense has
Your
been
spidey
misled.
sense
This is not part of a public, just understand this is not part of the
Ruffle some
public
your
hearing.
That's why I brought it up now.
Yeah, I guess what I would say is, but I would say this, and I think that there's a couple of different issues, and I want to put some fine points on things. So number one, just to make sure everybody's on the same page, as well as anybody from the public is understanding, the decision really isn't to allow cannabis or not. The decision to allow recreational cannabis in the state has been made. It is a land use decision in the sense of, we can't prohibit people from using recreational cannabis in Lake Bluff. The issue is whether to allow, and if we are to allow, under what circumstances, cannabis businesses from a zoning perspective. So it's a cannabis dispensary, a cannabis infuser, a cannabis craft grower, certain types of businesses that would be generating the sales and the products. We just looked at a car dealership. It's a dealership, so to speak, for cannabis. Do we allow it, and if so, where? So that's the fine point, which is a zoning decision. The second issue to think about this is, and under the procedure, it gets sent to you, and it has by the village board pursuant to the red flag resolution. So they have asked you for, procedurally, to opine, make a decision, whatever that may be, and you've been given a task by them. But the other part is, under our zoning code, it's not so simple as the board just saying, we're going to do this. Rather, our procedure is it goes first to the plan, the PCZBA, and then it goes back to them. And you're right, they can alter it, they can accept it, whatever the recommendation may be. And finally, kind of the third and final issue is, we are a little bit under the gun. The village could choose not to do anything And under our current code, we think it is prohibited. But at the same time, we want to guard against somebody trying to claim that they are a permitted use somewhere. So for example, if you have in your code, food processor or some type of food store, we don't want somebody, well, I'm selling baked goods that happen to have cannabis. I'm really that, I'm not, and your code doesn't say cannabis, recreational cannabis dispensaries are prohibited. And so part of this is getting ahead of the January 1st date. So that way whatever decision is made, one is made versus leaving it a little open-ended and possibly having somebody try to make an argument. So I think it is tough. Whatever decision that this body does make and how to handle it, I understand there's a lot of policy implications. But those things just keep in the back of your mind, both time frame, the red flag resolution was charged this task. And at that meeting with the board, I know that the board did not and really could not, at that point, make a definitive statement about what they thought, because they weren't collectively as a board adopting an ordinance. But I know several board members did make comments. So you can take those comments for what they're worth is perhaps, what their thoughts may be. But this has been a task that's been put before you.
So are we charged with coming up with regulations for cannabis, recreational cannabis, or are we the ones that are gonna say we don't want cannabis?
That, I think, is up to you. So the charge that, under the red flag resolution, was, it asked several questions. That you're tasked with, number one, deciding, do you want to recommend that it's prohibited altogether in terms of a zoning use, dispensaries and other cannabis?
we had that power.
Yeah, or if you are to recommend that you allow it, what would the regulations look like? So for example, if you were to decide that you would you want to make it a special use, a permitted use in certain zoning districts, what zoning districts, if there's other zoning requirements that you'd want to put on, whether from setbacks to parking, go down the list. If you are to have special uses, how many? You could limit the number. There's a lot of different ways you can go with it. But the red flag resolution kind of set up this, the first inherent question is a zoning use, would you want to allow it or prohibit it? And then that's up to you to, you all to decide what your recommendation's gonna be. Now, again, I know this is a tough task and whatever decisions are made here, yes, they can be altered by the village board. And I know these can be, hard debates, and it's a difficult policy consideration. But again, I keep in the back of your mind, we're looking at a January 1st deadline, and so, there's some, whatever policy you want to pursue, there are reasons to consider and deal with it sooner rather than later.
So is the point of the hearing then next month to consider the first question, ought we have it or not? Or are we hearing questions, hearing evidence on whether or what the regulations ought to be as well? Because it seems to me a very different exercise.
So all of it's on the table in terms of what's before you, and the notice for the hearing is quite broad. So all of it can be discussed, but it's up to you all to decide which way you're going. So obviously, any member of the public will have an opportunity to speak, and they're all invited to do so.
And they can speak on any topic.
That's relevant to the hearing, which could be, I support it, and this is what the regulations I'd like to see. I don't want any regulations, or let's prohibit it, whatever they want to say.
I see.
And then once they've all testified, it's your task to then decide, as part of your deliberations, what you're going to do. Now, one thing that I might suggest is once you do your public hearing, is you start in your packet is the from last meeting, and it'll be next time, the red flag resolution. And one of the things it does talk about, it sets forth the questions pretty clearly, and you can just go one by one. And, and if the first question is, do we prohibit it, and you believe, and there's a, majority that thinks that's what you should do, there is a draft ordinance that is in your packet, and it can end there. On the other hand, if you take a different view and you say, no, I want to do it another way, I think we should recommend allowing it, then you can then entertain the next question on that list. And that can you can use that red flag to guide your conversation.
So I would add, just as a neutral statement, right? So to the comparisons with the short-term rental discussion. In the short-term rental discussion, I think this board was referred, in some ways a broader mandate, right? Should we allow it, and if so, what should it look like? And that turned into, if I recall correctly, show us how you would ban it and show us how you would allow it, and that was the evolution of the discussion. In this case, the red flag resolution sets forth the four boundaries of the four walls, if you would, of the public hearing. I think you would recall, as Ben mentioned, that I believe every member of the village board that was present provided some indication of what their direction informally that the plan commission would consider recommending an ordinance banning this activity within the village, using the village's opt-out power under statute. I don't mean to suggest any course of action by that. I just mean to point out what it is. We're here to facilitate this group's deliberations where they go.
So is it your understanding that someone would present data that might be relevant, like anticipated tax revenues or anticipated increased police presence, or, and there is no petitioner putting forth the case, right? So how do we come by that kind of data if we think it's relevant?
Sure. So procedurally speaking, the village is the petitioner. I'd state that parenthetically. So we ourselves will, at the request of this body, are working on, are close to finishing a memorandum that explains some of the research around this subject. So looking at, to the limited extent that's out there so far, looking at public health issues, looking at crime issues, looking at what can we find in academic literature and professional publications, things of that nature. The public is welcome to submit those as well. So in the packet, we're going ahead a little bit, but you have 2 such exhibits submitted by members of the public. So one from James Arnold, a resident, is a proponent of allowing cannabis dispensaries within the village. Only his letter is in the packet. He has a number of academic articles he submitted focusing on the health benefits of using marijuana medicinally that we've provided you a link to. And conversely, you have a letter from Andy Duran, who's executive director of LEAD, which is a substance abuse prevention group, who is expressing his personal and his organization's opposition to allowing dispensaries to locate within the village, or if the village should allow that, outlining a number of alternatives that are generally more restrictive. And there's some evidence in there again as well. So specifically, he proposes that you could opt out entirely, you could do a temporary moratorium, you could limit a step that doesn't apply to us. You can limit them to industrial zones. You could impose a cap of 1, and then you can look at the time, place, manner restrictions that usually accompany these things. So some of that the community is providing us, some of that staff will provide. And if there's any specific directions you would like us to examine, we're always happy to incorporate that into what we're bringing you.
I think it's relevant for us to determine if there's tax revenue that is significant,
So the village would be able to charge up to 3%.
more than sales. So sales tax plus 3%.
Right. So you can, I'm not going to pretend I know, and I don't know that anybody fully knows exactly how much, what the sales volume would be
No.
at the dispensary.
You don't know what your competitors
but if
are,
you- but
where
let-
they are. or-
Right, but
Right.
if you do the math, if, they sell $2 million, you can kind of start to figure out kind of what it looks like. But, we're not talking about a situation, I think it's safe to say with a 3% additional over sales tax, you're not talking about, you know, you're talking 30, 60, 70, $80,000. You're not talking about, you know, it's not like a Target.
It's not gonna make a dent in people's property
It's
taxes.
not it's not an amount, like I said, like a Target or a Costco or a store that, you know, you're talking about raising 600 or $1 million or $2 million of sales tax revenue for the village in a year. So,
Lucrative for the amount of space it takes probably,
You know.
but not lucrative in the sense of the village's bottom line.
Especially when you consider the offsets of increased police presence, presuming that's been others' experience and that. I have another question, though. If we ban it in the village, can it just go across the street? Yeah.
Part
And
of the
so,
discussion.
who regulates what happens on the other side of Waukegan,
Sure.
other than Lake Forest? But who regulates
Yes,
north
on
of
the north-
176?
On the north side of 176, that'll be the county's jurisdiction. So Lake County, their situation right now is they have the same, we think they have the same rights as us to substantially impair or prohibit the establishment of marijuana establishments in the unincorporated part of the county. Their position that they've expressed so far, that the state's attorney, their legal counsel, does not think that's the case. They think that they may not have the ability to prohibit it in the county. I think I can say, I suppose I could say we disagree with that, but we would always counsel you to follow your legal counsel, so.
So if they
All
take
right.
no action, is it prohibited or allowed if they take no action on January 1? I'm assuming they can't,
Complicated.
yeah, all right.
So we, I guess it might be more productive to describe their process. So they have done something, used a strategy they've used in the past, which is they've convened a task force of Lake County municipalities that will review the evidence around this topic, not in a pro or a con sense, although there are those voices in the room. For example, Andy Duran was in the room, but are looking at the best practices that have developed elsewhere in the country around this subject. They're hoping to create a temporary moratorium ordinance, a permanent moratorium ordinance, and an allowance or a permitting, I guess you would say, ordinance, each with different levers to pull on as far as where you would allow it and under what circumstances you would allow it. That process is going to take a considerable amount of time. I mean, I think the earliest they would hope for, if they're on schedule, would be October. I don't know, we're not sure the county board's timeline for taking this up. Presumably, we think the county board would act on this after that task force has concluded their work, so it could be relatively late in the year. Certainly, I think it's obvious to all of us that what happens in Lake County certainly has some bearing on our decision and on our experience, what outcomes we'll see from this.
I mean, and the other thing to consider is, independent of what the county chooses to do, and let's say they don't permit it, the other thing is whether one will end up across the street is a whole nother issue.
Right.
And so you have issues where somebody would have to find a site that works, a site that's available. The state regulations are not out yet. The state is going to be putting out administrative regulations that govern how these can operate. So even if there's an available site, it's a little unclear, what is going to be practically done, because some sites just won't work under probably the administrative code of how these will be regulated. Then you throw in another complicating factor, which is if you are going to be leasing space, one of the challenges it becomes that any landlord of yours is going to have to probably get permission from a lender, and there are some lenders who are going to have issues because it's prohibited under federal law still. And then on top of that, the state does regulate the number of licenses that will be issued. So not to say that this wouldn't pop up near the borders, but the mere fact that it's allowed under from a zoning perspective doesn't mean that it's not going to happen. But it is a possibility, but keep all those factors in the back of your mind.
And a note I will add to Ben's note is the further along we get, it seems the more of these little holes people are finding, understandable in a 600-plus piece of legislation. But at the same time, whether we like it or not, today the state issued the first 5 or 6 licenses to existing medical marijuana dispensaries. And so,
Recreational use, they issued recreational licenses, or they issued?
yeah, so they
okay.
can't vend yet, but effective January 1, assuming they have local zoning permission, they would be able to.
And that's going to be different because there's several of those. There are some that are now in communities that are not going to allow it. So they may get a state license, doesn't mean they can operate.
So there's a lot of different threads to this, all going at their own speeds.
It's complicated, and if it would be helpful, we're happy to present kind of a PowerPoint and give it kind of at the hearing a full summary of the act, what it says is allowed, what's not allowed, what are the different types of businesses that are at issue, what your local powers are, and that may help clarify a little as you deliberate on these issues. So I hope that all helps before the next hearing.
Yeah.
And we do recognize that this is a difficult policy decision that everybody's going to have to think through and make.
Any other questions, comments on, okay? So our next month's agenda, to finish out the last points, pop. There'll be marijuana. There will be a request from the Park District. You'll remember last year you allowed them to go a little bit later, one day of the week, to make their paddle tennis league work. That request will be coming back, saw it on a permanent basis at the next meeting. Again, you'll remember there was a report this group received earlier this year documenting their neighbor outreach, no complaints. They'll get legal notice again about that in some form as we come towards this hearing. There'll be a special use permit for an animal training business in part of, I believe, Forest Bluff Animal Hospital here at 968 North Shore. You'll remember, again, you permitted it. This was recommended for and received a special use earlier this year, late last year. There's some excess space in there that could be used for similar business, but that's not a transferable permit. We'll have to come get a separate one. There will be those use text amendments for the L1 district that we've been talking about for some time. We do have one sticky little part that I suppose I'll mention now that we'll probably make you a recommendation on next month. There was a decision made last meeting to say that restaurants should be a permitted use. We don't necessarily disagree with that, but we think some of the framework isn't there for that. Typically, restaurants are parking intense. There's no separate parking standard for them. A couple other things like that we think maybe merit reconsidering that particular recommendation. You'll see that. There will be some sign code amendments from the Architectural Board of Review. They've been working on them for a few months. They're hosting their own hearing about it next Tuesday. Again, we have to procedurally host our own hearing as well, but we expect they're non-controversial. We think they're to the benefit of the L1 district, make it a bit easier to get signs out there. And then we'll also have some discussion about potentially about some other text amendments we're looking at in the code coming from the Architectural Board of Review, coming from some of our L1 discussions. It's a very meaty, nothing really too controversial aside from cannabis, but it'll be a meaty agenda. So we'll just say that to keep you informed of what's going on and make sure we're prepared.
I guess from a potential scheduling perspective, we can't speculate as to how long the public hearing might take on the cannabis issue, and we can't speculate as to how long our deliberations might take. But I think based upon the history of some of these more volatile issues, we could be looking at several hours. And I'm wondering, with respect to some of these other topics that are on the agenda, I guess right now, whether we should see, do they really have to be on that agenda that night? Or could we just kick them to October? And alternatively, for something like the Park District, should we put them into the number 1 or 2 slot, because we might be able to address that within 15 or 20 minutes, and then look forward to probably focusing on the cannabis issue for perhaps several hours. Historically, we're usually wrapping things up by 9 o'clock or so, and realistically, I don't foresee that on this meeting. I think there is some urgency from a timing perspective for the village to move forward. We've lost a little bit of time, but those are my thoughts anyway from a operational or timing perspective.
Is it feasible to start earlier? Start at 6 instead of 7? You provide the pizzas?
From a legal perspective, you'd have to call a special meeting, because our regular scheduled meeting is at 7. From a legal perspective, it's just a matter of
We can do
practical
it.
scheduling, if the members could do it and if the village could do
Yeah.
it, but.
What might, we'll look at some scheduling options. You'll probably see an email from me in the morning, and we'll look at, can we have people there at 6 early? I hesitate with 2 members missing. We might look at just having a day in reserve if we need to. It is true that it depends how productive you want to be. How we order these on the agenda is at your discretion. So if we do put these 2 items first, get to recreational cannabis, the rest of the agenda is all village initiated. It's not particularly time
But the special
sensitive.
use permit, we have to do that one, right?
You would move that up before recreational cannabis. So you just take care of those 2 in the first half hour or so. Take your time on cannabis, and if you have time left, you can deal with the other issues. If not, you can punt.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable from my perspective.
Okay.
And, if we can move it up, if we can get a full commission, if everybody's available at 6, and there aren't any legal barriers, I'd just as soon get started at 6 probably.
Okay. You'll see, again, we'll need to loop in our other 2 members, so you'll see a scheduling poll from me, probably first thing in the morning. We'll have to have this tied down by Monday when our notices go out, so if you can please pay prompt attention to that tomorrow. We appreciate that.
You can take a poll of this group right now. Or whatever.
I don't want to.
Make it official.
Yeah.
Good, thank you, Glenn. Agenda item number 5, Commissioners' Report.
None for me.
Hearing none, is agenda item number 6, adjournment. Is there a motion, please?
I'll make a motion.
Second?
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Motion carries.